Let's talk about ghostflame. This is a magical flame effect which is seen quite commonly. It's a strange flame that's actually cold rather than hot. It can be seen in spells like Explosive Ghostflame and weapon skills like the Helfen Steeple's Ruinous Ghostflame. Visually, it's a grayscale flame with some pale blue, maybe greenish coloration. Identified visually, ghostflame is commonly found on torches, often in catacombs. Deathrite birds smolder with it. Rancor, these angry flying skulls, almost always have a ghostflame effect on them. Ghostflame appears when you break up the encrusted bones on walking mausolea. The fallen hawks are constantly using ghostflame tools and weaponry. Finally, and most significantly, those who live in death seem to be animated by ghostflame. The flame itself needs to be attacked directly to put them down for good. There are various holy effects which will prevent this, but I assume those somehow attack the ghostflame directly. Okay, so it's some sort of death-related magical effect. What more is there to understand? When I look closer, I feel there must be more details lurking beneath the surface. Rancor is a good example. Almost all Rancor appears burning with ghostflame, and yet there are plenty of users of ghostflame which do not create Rancor. So one does not consistently lead to the other. Those who live in death are another such example. They're not exactly rare, but not all users of ghostflame create them, so what really causes them, and what's the connection? The fallen hawks are the ultimate counterexample here. Most of their lore is about them burning the bones of their fellows for light, giving them ghostflame, and somehow damning them. They use ghostflame constantly and extensively. Despite this, they produce no rancor effects, nor are those who live in death found around them. Now, maybe they use some fancy ritual we're just not told about, but it seems they achieved ghostflame merely by burning some bones. That doesn't seem that hard to do. My point is that ghostflame itself, though inherently fairly mysterious, seems like a simple and common phenomenon. Merely producing ghostflame is not enough to cause some of the effects associated with it, such as rancor, or especially those who live in death. So there's more to understand here. Plus, for me, it's not enough to think of it as a death-related magic flame. As I discussed quite extensively in a previous video, there's also the yellow-black Prince of Death's flame, which is also a death-related flame effect, though more rarely seen. So which death flame is used when, and why the distinction? An extremely brief synopsis of that other video is that the yellow-black flame comes from cursed souls which cannot animate a normal body, and that Godwin's soul has similarly been cursed. While these yellow-black flames are sometimes connected with Godwin's soul, this video will instead deal with the bodily aspects of death. Ghostflame effects are more associated with Godwin's body, at least when it comes to those who live in death. These spooky skeletons are one of the central Elden Ring mysteries. It starts right in the name, those who live in death. What does that mean? What could those terms mean for this to even be a sensible concept? Here I'm going to explore that and give my answer to it. The Deathroot item description tells us a lot. It tells us that it is a source of those who live in death. It hints that it comes from Godwin in saying that the Deathroot only spread after the Night of Black Knives. The disturbing Godwin-esque growths are almost always found in the same places that Deathroot is found, which to me solidifies the connection. Godwin's body is at some large roots, so it makes sense that Deathroot would spread through this root system originating from his body. But the Deathroot also explicitly says that it is a form of the Rune of Death. How is this possible, and what does it mean? What does the word death mean? What does the Rune of Death do? We have to be very careful about our use of words here. Let me lay out the confusion. Historically, the Rune of Death seems associated with ending the lives of beings who are already alive. That seems intuitive enough. Malekith held the Rune of Death, and this made him frightful even to demigods. When a piece of this was stolen during the Night of Black Knives, that's how it was used, for ending the lives of demigods. Furthermore, the Golden Order was created by confining destined death, which is echoed by the Mending Rune of the Death Prince, which I will discuss in depth soon. And it's not directly stated what effect that had, but it's commonly held that because the Rune of Death was sealed, living people were not able to stop living as often as they otherwise would have. I'm not speaking so circuitously for YouTube algorithm reasons. I would like to say people died less often under the Golden Order. Maybe they didn't die at all. But to say that sealing the Rune of Death stopped people from dying is practically circular. It doesn't help me understand anything. So I'm explicitly showing that, at least in these contexts, the Rune of Death is actually connected with ending lives, and the lack of it is assumed to relate to lives not ending. And that is indeed a very intuitive definition of the word death. But that's what makes those who live in death puzzling. Again, Deathroot is a form of the Rune of Death, so if Deathroot caused people's lives to end, that would make a lot of sense. But instead, it's a source for these animated skeletons. It seems to be doing nearly the exact opposite of ending lives. It seems to be putting some life back into biological matter, whose living days seem well and truly over. So let's understand those who live in death. This will be a roundabout route, and it begins with the Deathbirds of old. The Deathbirds quite famously used Ghostflame back when they were the ones performing death rituals. They also produced rancor in doing this. But this was a long time ago, before even the Erd Tree. Here's one more piece of the Ghostflame mystery, the Grave Violet. This utterly baffling item description says that these flowers are the hue of ghostflame, but these flowers are bright purple, violet you might even say, whereas ghostflame has little color at all, and a pale cool one to the extent that it does. So how can this make any sense? To me, the answer is that magic has changed over the eras. Before the Golden Order, the Rune of Death was not sealed. Its power was generally available. I believe that ghostflame used to incorporate the power of the Rune of Death, and that this also had an effect on its appearance. I believe ghostflame used to be purple, and it was at that time that this association with grey violets was formed. Then the Rune of Death was sealed, and ghostflame lost both much of its power as well as much of its color. But the flowers are still themselves, so they serve as a clue to the ancient past. I will refer to this hypothetical purple ghostflame as ancient ghostflame. The more familiar version we can commonly see in the game, I will call modern ghostflame. I will return to an analysis of the Deathbird soon, but with this in hand, let's continue trying to understand those who live in death. After all, Deathroot is a form of the Rune of Death, the missing ingredient, so it could perhaps revive this ancient ritual in its original form. But despite Deathroot being a source of those who live in death, they burn with modern ghostflame, nothing purple to be found. And so, I believe the other key to understanding those who live in death are the Tibia Mariners. These guys are purple as hell, and obviously they're closely related to those who live in death. Furthermore, every single one of them drops Deathroot when defeated. I believe these Mariners are the primary effect of the Deathroot, enabling a purple-hued ritual of old. In a way, they are the Deathroot, mobilized and in action. They are the source of those who live in death. I believe that nearly everyone who lives in death was originally created by one Tibia Mariner or another. It's true that most of those who live in death are not found in the vicinity of any Mariner, but the Mariners are easily capable of teleporting around, so just because there isn't one here now doesn't mean there wasn't one here earlier. A Mariner could have gassed up some old skeletons and then moved on, leaving the skeletons on their own. So what is the effect of this purple ancient ghost flame? Judging by the Mariners, it seems to allow a loose relationship with physical space. The Mariners are able to teleport around and float on water that isn't really there. And obviously, they have power over those who live in death. A power to guide souls, I would say. I think this is the intended effect of ancient ghost flame, giving souls the ability to move from place to place. Not only physically, but spiritually. I believe the ancient ghost flame aided souls in losing contact with the physical realm and helping them reach wherever it is they should go. But those who live in death seem to have the opposite effect. Far from being able to teleport, spiritually or otherwise, they seem rooted in place to these earthbound physical bones. I believe this is not what the Mariners intended, but it is a common outcome. There's only so much Rune of Death power available, and when it's insufficient, you get those who live in death. As Rajier said, they've touched on a flaw in the Golden Order. They're the result of a failed ritual. The ancient Ghostflame ritual was based on the assumption that the power of the Rune of Death was widely available, but now there are only limited amounts in specific places. Maybe it's a bit like using a certain technique for starting or spreading a fire, but that technique assumes there's more oxygen in the air than there actually is. Since the assumptions are wrong, it has mixed results. In defense of the Mariners, I believe a success on their part causes a soul to move on, which would leave no visual indication in the physical world. So we can't really tell how often they're succeeding, but we can see lots of their failures. I believe that, generally speaking, modern Ghostflame is a sign of an excessive connection to physicality. It shows up when something spiritual, like a soul, is stuck connected to the physical realm when it might otherwise move on, lose contact with matter, and exist purely in a more spiritual realm. Ghostflame is easy to produce under the Golden Order. Souls have a hard time moving on from bodies, generally requiring the Erdtree's roots to suck them out. This is one of the effects of the Rune of Death being confined. A brief summary. One of the powers of the Rune of Death is allowing souls to move on from matter. The Rune of Death used to help create purple-colored flame, which I believe was used by the Deathbirds, and is echoed by Tibia Mariners more recently. Those who live in death arise, ultimately, due to Godwyn's body, and the word death in their name refers to corpses specifically, not to any abstract concept of death. Although what exactly qualifies as a corpse is more a matter of opinion than fact, as I'll soon discuss. But their modern Ghostflame magic shows that they are trapped in the physical realm. Now let's look at Rancor. Rancor is also enwreathed in modern Ghostflame, and as such is tied to matter. Appropriately enough, Rancor is constantly related to wrath and vengeance, and is drawn to anguish. Rancor, I believe, is simply that, certain negative emotions manifested physically. Though it is related to Deathbird's rituals, I believe it arises more generally. For instance, these siren enemies can use Rancor. Another interesting example is the Family Heads weapon and its weapon skill, Familial Rancor. The interesting thing about Family Heads is that the heads are only representations, metal replicas of people's heads. They're not physical relics of those people's bodies. Yet the anguish from these representations is enough to invite rancor. It seems that negative emotion is quite native to matter, and easy to evoke in all sorts of ways. Perhaps this could be taken as a Buddhist-like commentary on an inevitable connection between physical existence and suffering. But how do Deathbird rituals fit into this? In particular, their ancient rituals should have used ancient ghostflame, yet the Rancor has modern ghostflame. In the modern day, the power of the Rune of Death is not available for the Deathbirds to use anymore, so now they produce modern ghostflame. That part makes sense, but I'm saying that in the past, the ancient ghostflame allowed souls to move on. Yet Rancor is also described as ancient. Why should these ancient cinders of the Deathbird's ghostflame have produced Rancor, emotions bound to the physical realm? Isn't that a purely modern phenomenon? I believe the Deathbird's rituals were quite elaborate and multifaceted, and have not been fully replicated anywhere in the modern day. I believe their main purpose was aiding souls in leaving bodies and moving on into a different realm, but there was more than that. Rancor was always part of the equation. Back in the ancient times, I believe this was a deliberately physicalized aspect of the ritual. They probably did use some modern ghostflame even back then, though it must have been much harder to produce, compared to the modern day where it seems you can create it practically by accident. Part of the Deathbird's ancient ritual, I believe, was intentionally binding the seething negative emotions of the dead to the physical world, before allowing their souls to move on. Doing this creates Rancor. The point is that the souls are purified, cleansed of their most miserable aspects, before departing to the realm of spirits. The rancorous emotions stay in the physical realm, while the rest of the soul leaves. You might even say that the ritual shrives clean the hearts of men. The ethical dimension of this is complicated, perfectly appropriate for a From Software game. On the one hand, you could easily see a spiritual purification as giving you a much better life from then on, but on the other hand, achieving this involves ripping out parts of your soul. Furthermore, those parts are left in the physical world. From a soul-centric perspective, you might see it as souls getting attached to the physical world for a time, then returning to the soul realm, cleansed and improved. But in this sense, the world of matter is just being used as a filter, a dumping ground, a sewer system. Those who do live in the physical world may not appreciate this effect, especially as it accumulates over time. So while I'm saying that the ghostflame we see in the game is a largely modern phenomenon, becoming common under the Golden Order, Rancor is described as ancient and existed even before the Erdtree. The Deathbirds were keeping certain negative emotions bound to matter, while letting the rest of the soul go free. In the modern day, all this emotional baggage continues to haunt the lands between. That's appropriate, since modern ghostflame is associated with being tied to the physical realm, perhaps too much so. Thematically, this also echoes the state of Godwin's body. Now I've described how I think ghostflame works, as well as its history, so let's look at the big picture. What of Fia and the Mending Rune of the Death Prince? What does the Mending Rune do? How does Fia create it? Let's understand Deathbed Companions in general. I believe the overall philosophy of the Deathbed Companions is all about the power and significance of physical bodies. Deathbed Companions understand that a body can have a very strong memory of its soul, and all their rituals revolve around this fact. Their ultimate goal is supposed to be to lay with the remains of some noble and give them another chance at life. How does that work exactly? It's expected that these remains could be quite withered and delicate. In other words, they may have been dead for a long time. I don't believe they have the power to revive the noble's body, but rather, they use the body's memory of its soul to try and attract that soul once again. The soul is meant to be born into a new body, birthed by the companion, who dies in the process. It might seem like a long-dead body has probably lost relevance to the soul it once had, but the Deathbed Companions say otherwise. I believe it is for this reason that Fia feels such an affinity for those who live in death. They're just bones, their body is almost entirely gone. Nonetheless, even bones have enough memory of their soul to bind some of it back to matter once again, thanks to the Tibia Mariners. Fia takes warmth and vigor from some unknown number of champions. She can then create what seem to be puppets of these fighters. However, she does this using only a bit of warmth from each. It goes to show that even a small amount of physicality can be so thoroughly evocative. This is a major philosophical impasse between the Deathbed Companions and the Golden Order. The Golden Order is very particular about what sort of physical form a living body should have. By living, I mean animated by a soul. Once a living body ceases to have the right form, in other words, becomes a corpse, then according to the Golden Order, it is no longer proper for it to live, to have a soul. But this is just one opinion. The Deathbed Companions have a different opinion. To them, even what would count as a corpse under the Golden Order often still has a strong memory of its soul. Therefore, it deserves to keep that soul, to stay alive. In other words, deathbed philosophy is much more permissive about what physical forms can and should retain a connection to a soul. The Mending Rune of the Death Prince would enforce this philosophy. Bodies will be able to hold on to their souls in many situations where the Golden Order says they shouldn't, as long as those bodies have some memory of their souls. This way, the laborious deathbed rituals will no longer be necessary. Their results would just be the default way things already are. A withered noble would still have their life and their soul, with no extra help needed. This is described as death restored and life within death, but that's only true from the current Golden Order perspective. If the Death Prince's order goes on for a while, then society would get used to it. During its early days, people might say that some corpses are now living, but after a while, they would no longer even be considered corpses in the first place. Why should they? They regularly live on. Again, when this description talks about death, it's referring to dead bodies, and only bodies the Golden Order considers dead. People fully immersed in this new order would not think of themselves as being in a deathly order. They wouldn't say anyone is living in death. But the description is not written from their hypothetical perspective, it's written from the current, actual Golden Order perspective. So the meaning of this description is a bit subtle. I guess another way to put it is that, under the Death Prince's order, the word death will take on a much narrower definition. You could only die when your body can no longer recall your soul at all, which seems like it will take quite a while. So this is the mending rune that Thea gives birth to. She probably can't birth a body capable of binding a demigod soul like Godwin's, not to mention how his soul is cursed, but instead Godwin's soul forms the basis for a new mending rune. Let's not overlook, however, that the last step in this process is fighting the Lich Dragon Fortisax. Not only that, but this fight happens in a dream. I think this is quite significant. Sleep and dreams are an important part of understanding souls in death. I'd say they're an essential part of the deathbed ritual, so called not only to imply a sexual component, but to relate directly to dream. I believe deathbed companions ultimately enter a deep sleep and use the noble's body's memory of its soul to seek that soul out. Dreaming is another non-physical realm, and perhaps there is only one of those, so dreams could be the same place that souls go once they no longer deal with matter. I think the realm of dream and the realm of the dead are one and the same. It seems the deathbed companion's soul never returns from this journey, so this is ultimately a form of death. Thea says she was in the middle of this process when Grace called to her. And then, a second time, at the end of her in-game questline, she uses Godwin's body to reach into Dream and find his soul. However, his soul is in the grips of Fortisax, who futilely resists the soul's cursed nature. Fortisax must be defeated before the soul of Godwin can finally become a mending rune. So we see that sleep is somewhat like death, with the soul leaving the body, though normally only very briefly. And as I've said, I believe Ancient's ghostflame was a purple flame based on the Grey Violet description. But there is also a purple flame already in the game, and it causes sleep. Like the Ancient's ghostflame, it helps a soul leave the physical realm and go to a soul realm, though much less forcefully than a Deathbird's old ritual, I imagine. But you can see that it's the same basic idea in both cases. And when we talk about purple flame and sleep, we have to talk about Saint Trina. And inevitably we also come to the topic of Mikola, who was likely also very interested in the whereabouts of Godwin's soul. First of all, what's the deal with Saint Trina, and how does she relate to Mikola? Fever's various cookbooks describe a person obsessed with Trina who ends up learning to create a powerful tool invented by Mikola. So maybe Saint Trina is Mikola. It's possible. I imagine, though, that the role of dreams is quite confusing to still living souls. Plus, many details experienced in dreams are often forgotten once awake. So a dreamer is sort of like those who live in death, in sore need of a guiding hand, in a realm they have little affinity for. Once it's known that someone called Saint Trina could guide you in your dreams, perhaps any entity that provides guidance in a dream could become known as Saint Trina. This could help explain the confusion around Trina's exact appearance. It may be a role more so than an identity, and various entities in Dream could have taken this role on from time to time. Mikola was perhaps one of these, but not necessarily the only one. Anyway, regardless of whether he acts as a guide or not, it does seem likely that Mikola probes the realm of Dream. I can't help but draw a parallel between Godwin's body, enmeshed in huge roots his soul found in a dream, and Mikola, who similarly enmeshed himself in the roots of his own tree, perhaps to deeply enter dreams as well. So whether or not Mikola personally ever guided people in Dream, which would lead to him being identified as Saint Trina, Mikola could have been encountered in Dream. So that could also explain how Fever learned his techniques, because Fever is just such a big dream explorer. A different hypothesis is that physical shape is just more malleable in Dream, so Trina takes on different forms for whatever reason. And this may be spurious, but I can't help drawing a connection between dreams and dragons. It is Fortisax who stands guard in a deathbed dream. But furthermore, the usual way to reach Far Modula seems to involve falling asleep mysteriously, and then just waking up there. Not to say that Far Modula only exists in Dream, but rather that there's some shared affinity there. The ancient dragon Lanciax is said to have taken human form from time to time. I find this a fairly mind-boggling claim, but it's a lot easier to swallow if she only did that in the realm of dreams. That's part of why I say that, maybe in dreams, form is more malleable. Or maybe that's especially true for dragons. If they are really so connected to dreams, maybe they have special dream powers. As for old Dragon Lord Plakidosax, I'm fairly willing to say that his fight actually does happen in a dream. It's easier for me to believe that you lay down and have a weird dream than believe that time actually reverses somehow. And it's only here that Miquella's needle works. If Miquella is also in dream, it makes some sense that you need to be closer to him to make use of one of his most potent tools. Since Miquella is in a dream, the needle only works in a dream. There's obviously much more which can be said about dragons, most of it a lot more solid than the rampant speculation I'm doing here, and for dreams and for Miquella, some of the available information may be scant, but maybe we'll learn more soon. To close this out, let me try to address one more detail which bugs me. It may seem like a dumb question, but why does Godwyn's body cause Deathroot to sprout? Remember, Deathroot is itself a form of the Rune of Death. Why does the Rune of Death emanate from Godwyn's body? I know he's called the Prince of Death and all, but it's his soul that the death was applied to, not so much his body. For the most part anyway. He did have a curse mark carved into him. Actually, I imagine this curse mark did have enough residual power to curse at least one more soul, that of Devon, Beholder of Death. After all, Fia seems to recover this curse mark from Darien, his twin. Fortunately for Devon, he had a twin willing to share his soul between their bodies, collectively becoming D. You have to wonder, if Godwyn had had a twin, it could have been a very different story. But anyway, aside from that, I think the deathly magic is mostly concentrated in Godwyn's soul, not so much his body, yet his body emanates the Rune of Death itself. Well, it does so in the form of a root, or some sort of plant growth at any rate. I believe this is actually caused by the Erd Tree itself. I don't think Godwyn's body alone would do this. The Erd Tree, however, is the physical nexus of all things holy to the Elden Ring, and that includes the Rune of Death too. Long ago, before the Golden Order, even though the Erd Tree was a lot less significant at the time, the power of the Rune of Death also flowed through the Erd Tree, or at least through its root system. So I believe Deathroot is the outgrowths of the residue of that time, encouraged by Godwyn's body. These meager growths aren't enough to do anything to Godwyn's demigod flesh, but they're enough to create a few mariners at least. So anyway, that's my cope to try and hold up my idea of the dualism demonstrated by Godwyn's weird body and his differently weird soul. And one more caveat. Mount Gelmir seems like an exception to all this. In the Gelmir hero's grave, Deathroot can be found, but I couldn't notice any Godwyn-like growths anywhere. Did I miss them? Also, Rykard has his own form of rancor, which seems to use real fire, not cold ghostflame, like all the other instances of rancor. So there's something weird happening on Mount Gelmir, but that's all I really have to say on it for now. That's a lot. Here's a quick review of what I think. In ancient times, ghostflame was purple, and deathbirds used it to help souls move on to the soul realm, while keeping the worst emotions trapped in the physical realm. After death and death was sealed, only keeping things trapped really remains possible. The Mariners are trying their best in imitation of the old ways, powered by Deathroot, which gives them a bit of that classic Death and Death power. Meanwhile, Deathvad companions use the underrated power of physical flesh to pull souls out of dream and back into physical life. But the Mending Rune of the Death Prince will make this unnecessary, as bodies' memories of their souls will be respected under this new order. And there's always more to wonder about. What about the Twin Bird? What about the dragons? What about the Tarnished, who are also dead who yet live? So I'll keep working at it. See you next time.